All right. Hello. I'm here with Bob Fischer. Bob Fischer is a professor of philosophy at Texas State University and a senior research manager at Rethink Priorities. Bob, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So the primary thing I want to talk to you about today is the Rethink Priorities report on animal consciousness, where you intended to measure sort of the degree of valence in the experiences of different animals. So what was the report? How was it done? What was the basic thing that you were aiming to measure?
Yeah. So the big idea is suppose you are trying to actually do the full utilitarian calculus and aggregate welfare, not just across people, but also across all beings with welfare, all sentient beings. Um, then you're going to have some method for deciding how you make these comparisons so that you know, well, how much welfare are you actually getting when you add a bunch of chickens to the scale, alongside all of the humans that you're interested in. And so, there's a very simple way of doing this, which is where you say, look, we're just going to measure everybody's welfare on a 0 to 1 scale, and we're just going to look to see, of all the ways they can be harmed, benefited, where does this appear to rank? So, chickens are really badly off in factory farms. Maybe they're,
What? I'm just
yeah,
hearing
I
all
know
this.
this is shocking. This is shocking. Brace yourself, Matthew. I didn't really want to tell you things like this that are so hard and dark this early in the conversation, but we got there. Sometimes it happens.
Yeah, I sort of
But
heard that they're living this idyllic life on the farm.
that's
I
true.
get my news from watching sort of pro-chicken advertisements. Is this not correct?
No, that's in fact exactly correct. And much of my career has been a sham because I've just been promoting fake news about how bad the conditions are. And I apologize deeply to all the people I've offended in that process. Um, anyway, like a simple way you can do this is you just do this kind of like simple normalization. Everybody's on a 0 to 1 scale. Predictably, if you do that, what happens is the most numerous beings just totally dominate the calculation, because there are just so many chickens and then so many shrimp and then so many black soldier flies. And so a lot of people have thought, well, that can't be the quite right. There's got to be some other story to tell here. There must be some differences in how much welfare um, chickens can realize or generate or experience compared to humans. Likewise for these other animals. And so the project was like, take that idea seriously. Suppose there are some differences in how much welfare is at stake in different beings, and then see if you can come up with a method for estimating what those differences are. So that then when you do the big sum, it might still turn out that, the most numerous animals dominate, but you've at least factored in this thing that seems relevant. Like, it really does feel like, or at least someone might think it is true that, things can just go better and worse for humans than they can for chickens, and so we should somehow account for that in our calculation. So that's what the project attempts to do, is give a principled method for doing those comparisons of welfare.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that it might sound like the sort of thing that's only the purview of kind of like a hedonistic utilitarian who's very convinced of the numbers. But really, so long as you take seriously the intuition that suffering is bad in virtue of the way it feels, then, insofar as there's lots and lots of suffering going on, it's worth taking that seriously.
Right.
You don't have to think that it's like the only thing that matters. You don't have to be a utilitarian. So long as suffering is one of the things that matters, which is among the most
Right.
uncontroversial of ethical judgments. Yeah, you get the
So here,
report.
right. So I gave you the very cause prioritization oriented description of the project. Here is a much less cause prioritization, just focused description of the project that would have potentially appeal to anybody who's ever thought about animals. It's something like, hey, sometimes your dog's sad, uh, and you could do things that would be worse for you but nicer for your dog, and you got to make a trade-off, and you got to figure out like, hey, would this thing that I might do for my dog be like better enough for him that it would be worth the little hit to me? And that's an interspecies welfare comparison. That is me comparing the benefit to my dog versus the benefit to me. If you want to do that, you got to be able to compare how well things are going for different animals, including humans, across cases. And that's a case where you can learn something by thinking about these kinds of methods that we were trying to develop and employ.
Yeah. So one way that some people have proposed measuring the degree of the degree of the valence of the experiences of animals is relying on neuron counts. This is a very common approach. It was the approach that was to a significant degree in vogue, at least prior to the Rethink Priorities report coming out. But in the report, you say that this is not a good metric. So do you want to explain for those, few people who haven't read in full the neuron counts report, what's so bad about neuron?
Yeah, right. Well, so I think just to get a bit clearer about the products, we sort of jumped into the deep end, but backing out a little bit. Again, you can ask this question. Okay, we have to set priorities across species. We have to decide how much different animals count in our calculations. If you are way into the weeds doing the utilitarian calculus, then the way you understand that project is just in terms of estimating how much welfare is at stake in different individuals, because all the utilitarian cares about is welfare. And so it's that simple. But if you are doing a wider range, calculations that don't necessarily depend on utilitarian considerations, and you're just trying to decide, well, how important is this animal relative to other animals, you might have this notion of a moral weight, which is the conversion factor that you think you apply to the interests of some animals to make them comparable to the interests of other animals, including humans. And so for a long time, a long time.
A long time in EA years.
Right, that's right, exactly. For a long time in EA years, one thought was, well, where do you come up with these numbers? Here's a simple way you could come up with these numbers, is you could just find a neurophysiological metric that would let you make a comparison. And what is a metric where we have some data already and it's relatively straightforward to make comparisons? Neuron counts. And what's convenient about neuron counts? Well, they sort of very roughly track people's intuitions about how much different beings matter. Not perfectly, because elephants have a lot more neurons than humans, and there are some other surprises here and there along the ordering, but it gives you sort of a scala natura that you might think is sort of roughly tracking things that the ordering that you might have wanted in the animal kingdom. And it has this virtue of being a very clean, simple metric, in much the way that like income is a simple metric for human welfare in in health economics, right? So people had used that and kicked it around. And I think the main challenge is, once you start to get more serious about trying to do interspecies welfare comparisons, is that there are really sort of two main issues. One is it's not really clear what neuron counts are tracking in the first place. Like, it's not obvious that they really track intelligence. A lot of what they tell you about is body size, because you just need more neurons to coordinate larger bodies. And it doesn't really seem like body size is the kind of thing that should be super morally important. It's not like I matter 3 times as much as my child because he's a third my weight. Like, just not the way it works. So that seems like it's just not obvious that we're getting something that's morally important out of the neuron count. But I think the other really more fundamental issue is that, like, what ultimately matters is what neurons can do, not what they're the mere quantity. If you use a lot of neurons to accomplish the same functions, then it seems like what you should care about is those functions rather than the number of neurons used to achieve them. And so, ultimately what we want to be looking at is these functional traits. How do we compare the things that animals can do, which seem to be the things that matter for welfare? And that's what we really were concerned about, was a kind of misplaced focus on something that seems pretty clearly not correlated with what matters most, and does not tell us about the thing that we clearly do want to focus on.
Yeah. I found that like I went into before reading the report, I was pretty sympathetic. It sort of seemed like neuron counts are probably it seemed like neuron counts are probably a decent metric. It would at least be very convenient if they were, following sort of ontological argument logic,
Right.
it would be nice if the greatest possible welfare proxy is greater if it's the actual one, and so therefore it must be neuron counts because it's very convenient to calculate. But I mean, it just seemed like one thing I found very convincing in the report was just the note that this is not how neuroscientists try to figure out the intensity of experiences. Like it's not like if a neuroscientist is trying to figure out how intense a person's pain is, they don't look at how many neurons they have that are active. And in fact, there's often this like very, there's not at all a linear correlation between the intensity of experiences and neuron count. And there's often this like inverse correlation. So often more active neurons leads to less intense experiences. Like, during psychedelic experiences that are really intense, sometimes, fewer neurons are active. It seems like what would be really nice if it were a proxy. It just seems like a very poor proxy. I found the report very convincing on that front. So neuron counts bad. So what method should we rely on in order to figure out how conscious different animals are? What is the sort of rough metric that you all used in the report to try to figure out the degree of valence experiences?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, I think there are a few things to say just as a preface. So the first thing to say is what we are trying to do in that paper, in that what's now a book, is sketch a method that you could use. Try to outline the kinds of considerations that would be relevant, ideally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows? Like, this is really hard stuff. Let's all be realistic. This is like just brutally horrible, impossible, challenging stuff. Maybe it turns out that there are some good reasons to hang on to something like neuron count as a metric in some contexts. We don't want to be overly critical of all of the very reasonable things that people have proposed. That being said, what we try to do is say, okay, here's what really matters. We don't have any like simple measurement tool that we can use to compare the intensity of valence states across species. Nobody has that. So what are we going to do? What we do is we say, let's think about what valence states are for. What is their function? Why do organisms have them? Then let's think about, and there are a bunch of different theories about that. They carry information, they motivate, they allow organisms to make trade-offs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's look at those functions and think about what are capacities that animals can have that are relevant to performing those functions. Let's go out and hunt for empirical information about those capacities. And then let's find a method for basically comparing the functional capacities of these animals based on the link to the functions of valence states. So, to give an example of this, if you think valence states are for is carrying information, like telling you, hey, that's bad for you. This thing is really hurting. That's evidence that something has gone seriously wrong in your leg. A wolf is biting you, etc.
That does sound like something is going seriously wrong in my leg.
It does seem bad. It seems bad. I mean, I feel like of all the things I've said today, that is not the least plausible. So it's conveying information about there being damage. Okay, well, if that's what's going on, then we've got a functional story here where this state, the purpose of this state is to convey a certain kind of content. So now we can ask, well, which animals are better at holding on to certain kinds of information? You know, what's the range of information they can carry? How much information can they carry, et cetera, et cetera? And let's look for some empirical proxies for information sophistication, information capacity, et cetera, in these animals. And then we'll use that as a metric for comparing the possible intensity of valence states on the assumption that if you can carry more sophisticated information, maybe you can carry more information about damage, the intensity of damage, et cetera. So is that a perfect approach? Not saying it is, but what it tries to do is say, let's take this thing that nobody really knows how to measure, think about what it's for, and use differences in functional capacity as a way of getting at the underlying thing of interest, namely the intensity of valence states.
Yeah. So for people who have the few people who haven't read the report for some reason, would you want to list just what are some of the metrics that you expect, like some of the specific behavioral proxies that you use as measures of like the degree of aversion?
Right. So it's not going to be the things that you might expect, so it's going to be, if you're thinking about something like, oh, well, we want to know about, again, information, you're going to be interested in things like, well, how quickly can animals learn? And can they engage in this thing called reversal learning, where they learn one association and then learn how to, switch to a different association between two stimuli? That's not the kind of thing that you might think, oh, that tells you a ton about pain intensity. But the thought is, no, it tells you something about the capacity of this animal to process a certain kind of information. And that might be relevant to something like pain intensity. And so then, there's a wide range of proxies. Some of them are very closely tied to pain, like, oh, to what degree does this animal respond to certain kinds of analgesics? And some of them, have very little to do with that. They have to do with certain kinds of social cognition, or they have to do with, evidence for metacognition or things like that. So it's a wide range of sort of intuitively valency kinds of proxies, and then things that are potentially quite counterintuitive because their relevance is via this functional story that we're trying to tell, where we're asking people to stop thinking just in terms of some simple metric like neuron counts, and instead think about, what are valence states for? What do they do for organisms? And how can we quantify differences in the ability to perform those functions?
Yeah. So, okay. So taking these things into account, suppose a person broadly, they think they're broadly on board with the findings of the report. What are some of the like important takeaways? What animals should we care about more than we might initially think? What animals should we care about less than we might initially think? What should be our main takeaways?
Right. So, I think the big thing to say about the work that we did was, one of the tasks was to come up with these point estimates that let you say, here are the relative differences in capacity for welfare across species. None of us ever thought that those particular estimates were something that you should put a ton of stock in. What we really were inclined to think is that you should focus on sort of general order of magnitude differences. How big, broadly speaking, are the differences between animals? And I think, framed that way, differences just aren't that large. Like, that's really the main upshot. That by and large, the main result is, hey, a method that you might employ is, I suddenly went dark. I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. My light has just been oscillating throughout the.
I noticed this as well. Oh,
yeah. I don't know why it is. I think it's a weird sort of defect of StreamYard where sometimes the light just switches on and off. It's very mysterious.
Yes. Well, I apologize. I'm sure that brief detour was very useful for everyone understanding exactly what's going on with respect to differences in capacity for welfare across species. That being said, so the big upshot is, hey, look, basically all the animals that we looked at, we thought the differences are not more than a couple of orders of magnitude. And yep, the animals that people think about the most frequently, pigs and chickens and maybe fish, they're broadly going to fall within an order of magnitude of humans. And then for a bunch of invertebrates, we think, well, maybe they fall within 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, which is basically a way of saying, you know, um, yeah, maybe when you break a chicken's wing, um, the possible intensity of that chicken's pain is not as bad as the worst thing that you could experience, but it might be, a third as bad as that. And that's really bad. Or even if it were a tenth as bad as that, that'd be really bad. Think about something that's a tenth as bad as the worst thing you've ever experienced. You probably still don't want to experience that either. And it seems like a really important consideration to have in mind. And it also means that when you think about animals that have not historically been the focus of animal advocacy, and like shrimp, insects, that they get on the list, right? They have some measure of welfare. Again, not as intense as humans, maybe not as intense as chickens, but not completely trivial either. And so that's the sort of striking result, and that's the thing that has the biggest update for me. I mean, from my perspective, what's the biggest upshot of the Moral Weight Project? This, which is the name for the huge thing that we did. It's that, yeah, I just wasn't paying enough attention to invertebrates. And that's a real shame, because it'd be way more convenient if I could ignore them. It's a total hassle to care about even more beings, to be honest. But I've pivoted my whole career to spend a lot of time thinking about invertebrates now and trying to figure out how to be useful in promoting invertebrate welfare, because I think they just haven't gotten the attention they deserve.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the case for caring about invertebrate welfare is just dramatically underrated. People spend very little time thinking about them, despite the fact that, I mean, just the farming industries alone, they kill
Right.
trillions of these creatures
Right.
in very painful ways. And so even if you give them only a little bit of weight, just the sheer number of them is such that it's so immense that probably it outweighs even other very significant issues affecting humans, just because just the numbers are so mind-boggling, and it's so underexplored. The number of people working on trying to make insect farming more humane is basically Dustin, and that's it's very few people, and it seems like more than 2 people should be working on the suffering of potentially trillions of creatures, especially given that one of the at the margins, it seems like efforts to help them can be really effective. So the Shrimp Welfare Project, with just a few $100,000, has helped many billions of shrimp, about 2.6 billion a year. But yeah, so this was also another sort of similar takeaway that I had. It seems like the Rethink Priorities report, and just sort of more general reflection on taking insects, on how we treat insects, makes it clear we should be caring more about insects and crabs and lobsters and shrimp. They're very small and they look weird, but turns out that the fact that a being is small and weird looking doesn't affect your reasons to care about them. If there were a bunch of very large giants that were constantly stepping up on us all the time, and they were, they thought we looked really weird, we would want them to, pay some reverence, to take our interests seriously. And same thing might be true of insects. So were there any particularly surprising comparisons from the Rethink Priorities report? Were there any animals that you're wow, octopi are way less conscious than I would have guessed, or something, or the relative comparison
Right. Well, so yeah, just a couple quick things. So one is, um, strictly speaking, we don't think about it in terms of like degrees of consciousness, although lots of people like to talk that way. The way we think about it is, you know, we think about consciousness as some binary thing, it's on or off, and there's just a probability that the animal is conscious. And then the question is just how intense can the experiences be, the positive and negative experience be. So that's the way we try to think about what the numbers mean. So when you say something like, oh, well, chickens fall within an order of magnitude of humans, what you mean is something like, take the worst pain that you think a chicken can have, and it's maybe a tenth as bad or or more than what a human can experience. That's what that would, how to translate that claim. I actually think it's probably their pains are more intense than a tenth, but that's beside the point here. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think there are any massively surprising results other than that the landscape is just flatter than I might have anticipated. I mean, I'm a professional philosopher. I've been thinking about animal stuff for whatever, 15 years or something now. Um, and I've been, very invested in animal, causes for a long time. But I still really have had, a pretty, yeah, just a pretty hierarchical picture where, you know, cows and pigs matter most, and all these other animals matter a lot less. And you know, yeah, that's sort of like probably offset by the sheer number of individuals, but maybe it's kind of close. And our confidence about the moral importance and um, the possible suffering of cows is so much greater than that of chickens that should really skew our uh, calculations such that it would make some sense to have even priorities across species. That was kind of the picture that I had for a long time, at least a decade. And then I think what really changed as a result of doing this project was coming much closer to the view that, yeah, the differences in the capacity for pain across these species are probably just totally trivial relative to the number of individuals. And so for the purposes of doing prioritization, you should mostly just look at the number of individuals. And I think that for me was the main upshot. Now there are still look, I am way less confident that black soldier fly larvae are sentient than that cattle are sentient. So that should matter in your overall calculations. I don't think and would not support having the animal advocacy movement shift all resources to invertebrates. But 5% of animal advocacy resources going to invertebrates, that seems very reasonable.
Yeah, I agree. So, okay, one objection that a person might have to this is maybe they say, okay, sure, this project is established, animals, they suffer within, a few orders of magnitude as much as us. But they might think, in humans, really intense pains are worse than any number of very mild pains. So no matter how many headaches you have, it won't add up to be as bad as a torture. And they think, well, insofar as, say, shrimp only suffer 1% as intensely as we do, even if you add up a bunch of experiences that are 1% as bad, they don't add up to be as bad as one human suffering. So as a result, we should take humans, or at the very least, some combination of humans and mammals and maybe birds very seriously. And we should continue holding on to the common view where basically we don't take insects or fish very seriously. I guess what would you make of that kind of worry?
Yeah. So that's a certain kind of, partial aggregationists or potentially anti-aggregationist viewpoint about the way you should think about welfare. And I'm very uncertain about fundamental normative principles myself and give a lot of weight to moral uncertainty. And so I hear that kind of objection and I think, yeah, that's worth taking seriously. Like that's one input to the deliberations. And that's one reason why I don't think that all animal advocacy resources should just pivot to invertebrates, because I do think we should take seriously the possibility that, the numbers count, but that, the very minor pains of the plentiful shrimp in the world, or the plentiful black soldier fly larvae in the world, don't morally matter collectively in the same way that the really intense pains of a single individual do. But one, I don't think we should put all of our credence on that. And so, because I think we should also put some credence on the straightforward aggregationist view, I think that should guide some of our resource allocation. So I think we can take that objection seriously without conceding everything to that possibility. The second thing to say is, look, there are still cases where there really aren't any trade-offs at all. Like some people, and I myself am probably one of them, like realistically, I'm going to work on animal stuff for the foreseeable future. I've had opportunities to pivot into other domains, to work on biosecurity or global health or whatever. And for whatever idiosyncratic reason, like I'm really committed to doing animal work. And even if I should do something different, I'm going to keep doing this. And so, for me, it might just turn out that the best thing for me to be doing is to be working on some of these neglected areas, because when you compare shrimp with chickens, maybe the difference is such that it doesn't really matter. And the number of individuals is more prominent. So even if the human animal comparison is such that you get this anti-aggregationist or partial aggregationist objection off the ground, maybe that's not going to work among animals. That's the second thing to say. And the third thing to say is, like, sometimes this just isn't super relevant practically for a different sort of reason. So, when a producer is like, if you're a shrimp farmer and you're trying to decide whether you should implement some humane practice, like for you, the counterfactual is not, well, if I employ this worst practice and save that little bit of money, then I will go and save the lives of starving children. Like you're not trading off any significant human interests like that. And so the moral reasons that those individuals have to make changes toward humane practices are just as strong, I think, even if you accept some partial aggregationist story. So I think that doesn't address the philosophical core of the objection at all, but I think it does get you to a bunch of ways that objection just isn't decisive for any of the practical questions that matter.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing is just that, like, even if you're a partial aggregationist, it's just very plausible that at least that like invertebrates are above the threshold where, so like take shrimp, for example, the ones that I've, spent the most time thinking about,
right.
The mean estimate of how intensely shrimp suffer is 19% as intensely as us. Now, don't take that too seriously. Really, you should think of it more as just like, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. But like, yeah. I don't know if something suffers 1 to 2 orders of magnitude as intensely as we do, it seems like the upper end of its suffering is just like, is above the lexical threshold. If there was a person who had only, 1/10 as many pain receptors as we did, and then just trillions of people like this who had adult pain receptors were basically being thrown on a big thing of ice where they froze and suffocated to death. We think, yeah, that's actually, that's a pretty significant issue.
That seems bad.
Yeah.
Seems far from optimal.
Yeah. And I mean, basically the only difference between that scenario and the shrimp scenario is basically shrimp are dumber, they look weird, and they're smaller. But like none of these are morally relevant. I mean, intelligence is maybe morally relevant to some degree, but it's not like, single-handedly determinative of how bad your suffering is. It's not like, well, so long as you can't take the SAT, okay, then trillions of you being thrown with a bucket of ice and freezing and suffocating to death is just totally irrelevant. I think I'm broadly in agreement with you about the kind of aggregationist objection, or like I think you should have uncertainty about aggregationism, and then even if you are certain of a kind of non-aggregationism, it's just very plausible that like the animals are above the threshold. Even if you think like even if the threshold for some reason only kicked in at humans, we don't know how confident how conscious animals are, such that you should have a few percent of your credence in just like maybe animals suffer as much as we do or more. And I think that was one of the that was a few percent in the Rethink Priorities report. And then if they suffer as much as we do or more, then definitely.
That's right. And I think it's just pretty easy to see how you can end up in those kinds of views, right? So like one view that I'm not totally convinced is right, but I think it's hard to explain why it's wrong, is just this relative view where you think, well, look, all pain intensity is a relative measure of the severity of the hit to fitness that you're currently getting. And if it's a relative measure, then the tops and the bottoms of the scales are the same across all kinds of species. And so okay, you should just think their pains are as intense as ours, because there's nothing else to a relative scale than it's being either at the top or the bottom. And that, again, not saying that that's true, but it's hard to explain. It's hard to be totally confident that it's wrong. And if it deserves some of your credence, then suddenly animals suffering looks like a much larger deal.
Yeah, there have been various arguments that people have proposed over the years for why maybe even the less intelligent animals, maybe they even suffer more or a similar amount to us.
Sure.
Like, Dawkins has proposed
exactly
that, if an animal is more like the purpose of the evolutionary purpose of pain is to sort of teach us a lesson, this might kill you, don't do that. But insofar as the animal is really dumb and has a poor memory, you need to inflict more pain on it in order to leave the same kind of lasting impression. The other thing is insofar if the animal is really really simple mentally, then insofar as it's in pain, it doesn't have very robust memories of the past. It doesn't have very robust memories of the future. The pain effectively occupies its entire existence, and you should have some credence in the pain that occupies a creature's entire existence being really, really bad. Like in any time in humans that a pain is so severe that you're thinking of nothing else and the pain wholly occupies your consciousness. Anytime that happens, it's really bad,
Bernie Rollins says that when that happens, the animal is its pain. And that way of putting it is quite visceral. I also think people, when they think about this, they often forget the most intense pain experiences, and they rapidly try to focus on other things, and they're like, oh well, yeah, but imagine how sad I would be if I lost my daughter or whatever else, and that would just be so terrible. And I agree, in terms of the overall impact on your welfare, that would be catastrophic, and I absolutely. But when people experience absolutely blinding physical pain that really does consume all of their attention, I think in that moment there might not be anything worse. And I think people forget just how radical that kind of pain is, or have never experienced it in the first place.
Yeah, I remember there was some piece that I read a while back that was making the case for suffering-focused ethics, for thinking that some kinds of suffering are so intense that no amount of well-being can outweigh it. And I mean, it just described these really horrible instances of intense suffering. And I don't buy the whole stuff that suffering is categorically worse than any amount of well-being. But when you take seriously just reflection on what it's like to be in really intense suffering, it does seem like the fact that we are inflicting this kind of really intense suffering that precedes death on trillions of animals is very morally serious and something that's worth doing something about.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I mean that seems like a good note to end things on. That it's bad to inflict suffering on trillions of animals.
We've reached a point of deep agreement, so this is good.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. I think this has been a good discussion.
Pleasure, Matthew.
Any closing words? Places where stuff people should read about related topics.
Well, if you are interested in reading the updated version of all of this work, it's now an open access book from Oxford University Press. Maybe you can drop a link into the show notes so that people can find that. And there are all sorts of details buried in that, and ways of trying to make this whole project more accessible and clear. So I hope that's a useful resource. But I also think that more generally, the best thing to do if you really want to get a handle on what can be done for these animals is to just start looking around at some of the great resources that are being developed by groups like Shrimp Welfare Project and others that are finding material ways of changing the lives of some of these animals. And that's the sort of thing that can matter to us, even if we're not that sure how much shrimp matter. Just discovering, hey, look, there really are ways of making a difference, and it doesn't take that much money to make a difference, is exciting. I think a really important part of making progress when it comes to changing our own attitudes toward these animals.
Yeah, I was shocked to learn just how effective the Shrimp Welfare Project is. I mean, per dollar that it's gotten, it has averted about 1,600 painful shrimp deaths. Sorry, 1,500 per year. And so what it does is it provides these electrical stunners that keep being used every year. And so probably in total, per dollar it's getting, it's preventing like tens of thousands of shrimp from having these very painful deaths of slowly suffocating to death and freezing to death. And it makes it so that their deaths are instead painless on account of them being stunned. So yeah, I mean, it's just wildly effective. And there are others that might, that are similarly effective, like maybe the Insect Institute. Yeah. So yeah, I echo the encouragement. Check out these organizations. They're working on invertebrate welfare. They're radically underfunded. And I think the philosophy behind caring about them doesn't require committing you to anything that controversial. It doesn't require being a utilitarian. It just requires taking really extreme suffering seriously. And that's something
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, pleasure, Matthew.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. All right. I'll end the recording.